Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Joshua Jelly-Schapiro presenting his new book, Names of New York, Discovering the City's Past, Present, and Future Through Its Place Names. He will be talking with Matt Weiland, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Joshua, Matt, and the team at Pantheon for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen, but the exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. There are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your thoughts and comments in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. So if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure that you're putting your questions there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Names of New York, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations from 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Joshua's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat in just a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Matt Weiland. He is the co-editor with Sean Wilsey of the best-selling State by State, a panoramic portrait of America, and he wrote the introduction to the NYRB Classics reissue of George R. Stewart's Names on the Land, a historical account of place naming in the United States. Originally from Minneapolis, he lives in Brooklyn. He will be speaking with our featured author, Joshua Jelly-Schapiro. He is a geographer and writer whose books include Island People, The Caribbean and the World, and with Rebecca Solnit, Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City atlas. A regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, his work has also appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and Harper's Magazine, among many other publications. He is a scholar in residence at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, where he also teaches. His new book, Names of New York, is a fascinating journey into the past, present, and future of New York City. The book has been praised by celebrated writers such as Rebecca Solnit, Luke Sante, Suketu Mehta, and Gia Tolentino, who says, "Reading Names of New York is a casually wondrous experience. It made me feel like the city was unfolding beneath my feet. This treasure is a book of surprising, delightful, and often quite quietly heartbreaking. It doesn't just satisfy curiosity, but creates and renews it, illuminating the palimpsest of human conflict and devotion that lies just under the everyday landscape of New York." Joshua is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Matt and with all of you. Please take it away, Joshua.
Thank you, Katie, for that lovely and generous introduction. Thank you all for coming here on this beautiful spring evening to a Zoom session. Delighted to be here with Matt and all of you, and with Greenlight, one of my favorite places in the world. I can't wait to be back there at the store in person. But for now, I'm going to start us off with a brief reading from the introduction to this book. This book, Names of New York, which Matt and I will be talking about, and I'm excited to talk about with all of you, got its start a few years ago when I was immersed in working on this atlas of New York City, which meant being immersed in the names of New York, the names that make up maps of the city. And so this is a book obviously about those names, but it's also a book about the power of names and why they matter and how they shape our minds. So I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the introduction about those things, and then we'll get into a conversation. Names matter. Just ask any parent agonizing over what to call a newborn, or any kid burdened with a name they hate. Just think of the song made popular by Johnny Cash about a boy who explains that life ain't easy for a boy named Sue and confronts the father who named him. "My name is Sue. How do you do? Now you're gonna die." Whether you traverse your life as a Jane or an Ali or a Joaquin or an Eve, or you decide as a grown-up that you'd rather endure or enjoy it as someone else, we all learn that names mark us. Totems of identity, systems of illusion, Names can signal where we're from, who our people are, who we attach ourselves to, which Bible character or dead relative or living movie star our namers loved best. Murmured by an intimate or yelled by a foe, a name can be an endearment or a curse. Declaimed by protesters in the street, a name becomes an assertion of dignity, of rights, and of the refusal to overlook or forget. Names are shorthand, they're synecdoche, they're acknowledgements or shapers of history, containers for memory or for hope. And if names matter so much when attached to people, they matter even more when attached to places as labels that last longer in our minds and on our maps than any single human life. Name, though it seem but a superficial and outward matter, yet it carrieth much impression and enchantment. That's how Francis Bacon described the matrix of associations we affix, consciously or not, to the public words by which we navigate our days. Place names can bind people together or keep them apart. They can encode history and signal mores. They can proclaim what a culture venerates at one moment in time and serve as vessels for how it evolves and shifts later on. Gettysburg, Attica, Stonewall, Rome, Wall Street, Main Street, Alabama, Prague, Malibu, Beirut, Boca Raton. Place names can summon worlds and evoke epochs in just a few syllables. They can recall long ago events or become, as settings for more recent ones, metonyms for historical change. Place names can become styles of dress, Bermuda shorts, capri pants, and of dance. Once we did the Charleston, now we do the Rockaway. They can hail rebellions or honor heroes or spring, like Sleepy Hollow and Zion, from books. Whether a name's born of whimsy or faith, whether it was written down by a cavalier in his log or a bureaucrat in City Hall, its impression and enchantment derives, too, from the truth that its meaning can't be fully divorced from its roots. In place names lie stories. Stories in the first instance about their coiners. Tales, say, about the long ago Dutchman who wandered an island of wetlands and hills that the people who lived there may or may not have called Mannahatta, but whose northern acreage those Dutchmen named from a marshy town in Holland called Haarlem. Then there are also stories about the complex or contradictory processes by which certain labels come to be recognized as official. Stories about how people, singly or in groups, attach certain attributes to place names that grow iconic. Iconic of, for example, as with 20th century Harlem, Black culture and pride. And stories too about all the ways that such words thus do much more than merely label location. About how these words and their rhythm and sound and how they look rendered into Roman letters or affixed on street signs and maps have the power not merely to locate experience, but to shape it. Not merely to label the locales to which they refer, but also in some mysterious and beautiful way to become part of them, as the writer Henry Porter put it. Portals through which to access the past. Place names are also a means to re-examine, especially in times of ire and tumult, what's possible. And nowhere is this more true than in a great city, a place, as the geographer Yves Foutoin wrote, that can be seen as a construction of words as much as stone. Cities are monuments to civilization and creators of encounter. They're nothing if not generators of tales. And if language is consciousness and humans are a place-loving species, then place names, toponyms as they're called, may mold a larger piece of our minds than we think. So it's just a taste of the introduction and sort of why and how I care about names. And I'm thrilled to be here with Mr. Weiland, who's another lover of place names. Thank you, Matt, for doing this.
I sure am. I'm delighted to be here, and what a terrific reading that is. This book is just a delight. It's charming. It's unbelievably informative, and there's so many things I love about it. I love that you've taken, a city that is best known for having numbered streets and gotten us to focus on not just why all the other great names are so interesting, where they come from, but the numbers themselves. I love that bit about how we mold the city and we make the names, but the names also make us. And one thing that runs throughout this book, and I think every reader will enjoy, is that it's not just a list or an encyclopedia or a treasury or a compendium, though it's all those things. It's chock full of amazing things that I certainly didn't know, but it's almost like a pocket history of New York that you've written, which is all credit to you and all congratulations to Pantheon Books on a fabulous book. I've always loved the fact that you're a geographer. I got to admit that, like, geography is one of those words like civics or something that just gets a bad rap, or humane, and it's actually like a glorious thing. And I just wonder, like, geography is so central to the work you do in those fabulous atlases and in this. Like, does geography mean something different to you than the way usually people use the word in common speech?
Yes, well, I love, by the way, you rhapsodizing about geography with a beautiful map behind you. It's extra excellent to hear. But no, to be a geographer, I mean, it's funny. It's a question I get often. You know, I went to grad school for geography, and people often ask, they say, what is that? You know, you memorize all the capitals in the world or something? You know, would that it were so. I can't say that I know all capitals in the world. But no, to be a geographer in that way, to me, means to think and to try and write and reflect deeply on place, on how and why place matters to human beings, on how and why it's only in and through place that we figure out who we are, what we want to do, where we want to go. So to me, place is just a magical thing, and I think that it runs through all my work as a writer. It runs through the work of, you know, many of the writers I love best, and so in this book, as you say, certainly it's a compendium of facts. You know, it's there's a lot of information in it that I owe deep thanks and citations to all the, you know, the borough historical societies and the wonderful obsessives of New York, from whom I've borrowed and sort of used their research and so on. But it aims to be this journey and this essay and this sort of consideration of experience, of the ways in which place names, as I alluded to in that introduction, you know, perhaps mold our sense of ourselves in the city, shape our identity, whether that's about a neighborhood identity or an intersection we care about. And I love what you had to say too about intersections, or I should say numbered intersections, and the ways in which streets that are numbered and just have the grid, of course, is what's iconic about Manhattan's geography and streets. But I love this line from, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre showed up in Manhattan at one point and said, you know, the grid, it's like, I'm never lost, but I'm always astray. Which is to say that he felt like the sort of anonymity of it didn't sort of fire his imagination. And I think one thing that's fascinating to me is that it's also the case that many of the numbered streets, right, because of the sort of nature of New York, and I think the intensity of experience or of cultural production or what gets projected onto the city, that so many of the numbered streets even have meanings. You know, obviously 125th Street as a sort of icon of Harlem, Fifth Avenue, obviously. Think of songs, think of, you know, absolutely 4th Street, or you think of 53rd and 3rd, the Ramones, right? A sort of banal intersection, but now it's become iconic to anyone who grew up with that music. So that's one of the things that this book is about. You know, it's about, yes, it's about where the names come from, but then it's about all the sort of incredible stories by which they take on these meanings. And part of that, as I say, is about the songs that are written about them, or the books that are written about them, or they're obviously just about the experience that all of us have of where we live in the city.
That is well said. And that fact of discovering all those stories, that's another thing I loved about the book, that it's even in the subtitle itself, and it feels like your quest, you know, to learn, discover. And so I really enjoyed that. And it goes all the way back, of course, to the, you know, indigenous and Native American names. I think most people would know Manhattan, of course, and maybe Gowanus, but Rockaway and Canarsie. I wondered if you were, in the course of, you know, doing the research and writing it, whether you were surprised that there were so many Native American names still extant on the land, or so few. Like,
it's a great question. I mean, that aspect of the book is one that I enjoyed, perhaps more than any other, in a way, the sort of digging into the names before, as I call that chapter, on sort of Native American place names. But I want to say, you know, before I sort of get into that the book that Katie mentioned in the intro, that you did the introduction to, right, Names on the Land, this marvelous book that everyone here should read, this amazing kind of classic on American place naming that Matt did the introduction to. One thing that George Stewart says in that book is he says, one thing about studying place names in the so-called New World is that the layers are sort of there to be dug up and excavated, right? Because our histories go back, at least this history of New York as a European city, right? It's just several hundred years, it's not several thousand years, right? So you can sort of dig into the Dutch layer, the English layer, you can sort of understand why a place was called, Providence or Troublesome Creek or Cape Fear, or, whatever across the US. But obviously there is this layer of indigenous names. And in researching them, one of the things I was interested to look at, of course, is all the ways in which these names, of course, the people who lived in this part of the world, the Lenape people who spoke a language called Munsee, which was an Algonquian tongue. They'd been here for 1,000 years or so before Hudson showed up. And obviously they had all kinds of language, all kinds of expressions for where they lived, the environment where they lived, particular places in it. But the dynamic by which various of their place words, come to be placed on European maps is, of course, a kind of tricky one, because it's in part about how their speech sort of struck these Dutch and English ears, and then how those sort of sounds got written down in Roman letters, as I put it in the intro, right? And so some of it is just sort of guesswork in terms of trying to understand, what was that word? How might these colonists have heard it? What does it mean? But there is, of course, now this wonderful kind of revival of interest in Munsee, in the Lenape language. Those people, by and large, there's not many of them who remain in the larger New York metro area. Most of their descendants who are still with us are in Oklahoma and Ontario. But there is this wonderful kind of energy right now behind sort of not reviving the Lenape language, because it's still with us, thankfully, but of teaching it and keeping it healthy, and sort of trying to understand where many of these place names came from. You mentioned Rockaway, Canarsie, obviously over in New Jersey, we have many. We have Hackensack and Hoboken and Passaic and so many more, Ho-Ho-Kus and Tuxedo Park. People think of, tuxedos, but that's a Lenape word as well. Maspeth, I love, means bad water. Which, if you know, Newtown Creek is sort of ironic, as opposed to Amagansett, which in the Montaukett tongue means good water, which is amusing if you've been out there and you call it Amagansett. But no, to answer your question, I think that no, I was surprised, in a word, to sort of dig into this wonderful scene of linguists and activists around indigenous histories and rights in this part of the world and across North America, who have been doing this work to understand what these words mean and to nurture those histories, which is
it may be,
a vital thing for us to be doing.
It'd be amazing if we discover some make some new discoveries about some place names that we hadn't realized, given all that interest.
Absolutely, and you mentioned Gowanus, for example. It's funny. There's so many place names that clearly Gowanus was the name of a Lenape leader in the area, in that part of what's now Brooklyn. But the theory is that the Dutch sort of took that name because the waterway, the namesake waterway, reminded them of the How River in Poland. So it's this funny thing of, and there's so many stories like this where a sound just sort of strikes people's ears in a way that either reminds them of home or makes them think of something that they're attached to, and thus is born a new name, right?
With the Dutch, I was sort of fascinated to realize, the Dutch were, only in control for 40 years or something, but there's so many Dutch names, and that I think I was writing them down, Yonkers and Greenwich Village and Coney Island. Spuyten Duyvil has always been the one that's caught my ear, and you have a fascinating story in the book about that one. That's when, to any New Yorker, it just
absolutely. Well, that's one of those great. It just sounds this kind of old Dutch ring to it. It just sort of puts you in mind of Rip Van Winkle or something as you're heading up out of the city on the train to cross Spuyten Duyvil. But yeah, those syllables, they mean the devil's whirlpool. So it's this wonderful kind of evocative. Wow, there's these sort of eddies in the Harlem River there where it hits the Hudson. But to my mind, I think that why many of those names stuck, it seems to me clear that the ones that really did stick is that the English and others kind of took a liking to them. They said, "Ooh, this is kind of nice. It evokes something. It evokes this kind of old world allure, or this something they liked about the sound."
Is that the case with the word kill? Because that's one that like every New Yorker, I think, encounters and thinks, what an odd, like fresh kills. And is that an example of that?
It is totally, because kill, right, in Dutch just means waterway or creek in the old Dutch. And the English seem to have taken a liking to that. So that they, there are obviously, the Kill Van Col and all these others that still have a sort of Dutch name, but there are many that the English clearly just, fish kill, for example, or, it sounds like, oh, they're just killing a bunch of trout there. But no, it's a sort of mix of the English and Dutch in this one. Fresh kills as well. I could give you another, Gramercy Park, for example, which Gramercy, it sounds vaguely like some sort of distinguished English thing. But no, it just comes from the Dutch name for that part of Manhattan was the Krommers, the crooked marsh, because it was a watery part of the city at that point. And the English seemed to just kind of riff on those sounds to create this word, Gramercy. And that happened a lot. Coney Island, as you know, right. It was Coney Island to the Dutch, which meant island of rabbits. Coney Island doesn't mean anything in English, except for now it means, amusement parks and cotton candy and going to baseball games in the summer. But no, it seems that basically the sort of riffing on old words seems to be much more common than you might think. And
I like from that era, the example you gave that was fascinating to me was Hellgate Bridge.
Totally, the Hellgate, right? Is that the Dutch word for it? I'm forgetting what. Essentially, it looked like the English words Hellgate, but it didn't mean Hellgate, right? And the English, because it had this sort of all these rocks that boats were crashing into and so on, they said, "Oh, that fits. We'll call it the Hellgate," even though it didn't mean that in the Dutch.
Well, the other thing that this brings up and that you move into the book is as after the colonial period, when the city is becoming American through and through, and in a way, it's fitting to be talking at or virtually at Greenlight. We're DeKalb Avenue and Lafayette Avenue and Fort Greene are all down. Can you talk a bit about the effect of the revolution and the revolutionary period on New York City?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, there's nothing like a revolution for sort of revolutionizing names, right? And so the most obvious impact of the sort of war against the British, right, was that in its aftermath, there was a moment of just expunging all the sort of references to the king, to the queen, to all these kind of, Prince Street survived, right? We still have Prince Street in Lower Manhattan, but there was a George Street, there was like 3 King Streets, there was a Queen Street. All these streets are gone, right? And so that was the first initial thing, replaced with, lots of stuff named for Washington, and Madison and Jefferson and all these things. But another interesting impact of the Revolutionary War, also, by the way, I should say that many of the streets of Soho, of course, are named for heroes of the war who aren't necessarily sort of everyday names in terms of founding fathers and so on. But Green Street there, Thompson, Sullivan, all these streets are McDougal, all these streets are actually named for heroic figures of that era. But what I was going to say about how it changed in general names in the city are that there was an effort really to kind of rationalize, if you like, or to make New York a kind of city of the future, and America, had this kind of self-regard as this hopeful beacon for the world and so on. And so one of the ways in which that got sort of translated onto the map was to essentially try and do away with the fact that here in Manhattan and Brooklyn and the places, parts of the city that were developed at that time, resembled London in the sense that they often had a different name for every block. You'd be going down the street and you'd be on George Street, and then it would become King Street, and then it would become Little Jones Street, and then it would become Great Portland Street. If you've been to London, you sort of know that feeling, and it's impossible to navigate for that.
Getting lost constantly because of it, yeah.
But so there was an effort to kind of say, no, we're going to have streets that we live on, and that they're going to have the same name all throughout, from start to end. And then, of course, you have the story of the grid in the early 19th century, which is the sort of story about the creation of urban geography in Manhattan, at least. But anyway, that's a couple of things that happened.
You also tell one other fascinating story in that part about democratization, about another change that differentiates New York City from London and other places, about a linguistic change about how we refer to where we are, where we live traditionally, right? About whether you live on a street or in a street. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I thought that was totally fascinating.
Totally, I love that you picked up on that. Yeah, again, if you sort of are familiar with British English, or if you're not, it's often sort of strange to hear people say, no, I live in Main Street, or I live in Lafayette Street, or Fulton Street in the case of Greenlight books, right? So the preposition is in. And I think it seems that it was part of the kind of change toward conceiving of streets like rivers, in a sense, that a street is meant to actually go for miles and miles like a river. And so there was this subtle linguistic change that happened, which led to Americans, to all of us, as we still do, say, no, I live on Lafayette Street, I live on Fulton, I live on the Bowery, right? As if you live on the banks of a river. And so it's a fascinating, just very subtle change. But I think that it was one of the ways, whether consciously or not, that Americans and New Yorkers in particular sort of sought to differentiate themselves from the people they just freed themselves from.
I also thought one of the great things in the book, one of the weird things in New York is, especially for those of us who come, like I come from Minneapolis, where the river runs right through the city, and you always are aware of where you are in relation to the Mississippi, to the river, because you're crossing over, and that's true in London, of course, too. In New York City, you're not really aware much of the time of the rivers. You orient yourself, at least in Manhattan, by Broadway, and looking at, traditionally for all kinds of reasons, the city has looked away from the rivers. But you have this fantastic chapter in the book about the islands, and it really, I don't know, it's really eye-opening to me, not just about names, which are totally fascinating, but just how New York City, I mean, it's so obvious, of course, but it is a city of islands. It also struck me, it seemed like you had a lot of fun writing that chapter and reporting that chapter.
Absolutely. Well, I wrote a book about the Caribbean, so clearly I have a thing for islands in general. But no, and part of the fun of that chapter was just wanting to get out on the water. And I found this wonderful guy called Rob Buchanan, who's part of the Billion Oyster Project, this wonderful project to try and reseed the harbor with oysters. And he took me around, and I got to go around with some other people. And obviously now all of us, because of expanded ferry service, can get out on the water, which is a wonderful thing. But yeah, no, my fascination with islands runs deep, in part, I think, just because of, as places, they do seem to exert a certain fascination on human beings. We've thought of them as paradises or prisons or utopias. So we project things on the islands. And New York, as you say, we don't often think about it, but it's an archipelago. It's a system of islands. Manhattan obviously is an island. Staten Island obviously is an island. But Brooklyn and Queens are on the nub of Long Island, and then you have dozens and dozens of little islands, some of which are well known. Obviously, Liberty Island, Ellis Island. People know Governor's Island off the tip of Manhattan. But there's all these wonderful little islands, many of which have crazy and evocative names. You have the chimney sweeps up off the Bronx, and North Brother and South Brother Island, and an island called Big Tom. And you have all these hard islands, which has been in the news because it's it was the Potter's Ground, the cemetery for New York's unclaimed dead for a very long time, remains so. Soon not to be, but has been in the news. Hard Island, in fact, interesting story. There's two theories as to its name. One is that the geographer the cartographer, I should say, first put it on a map in English times, thought it looked like a heart. That's one theory. The other theory is that heart, it's a kind of old English term for stag, for deer. And so perhaps there are a lot of deer on it. In any case, when you get into these stories, right, there are many theories often competing.
I like that there are some places that we just don't know the reason for. I want to just interject and say that people should be thinking up question for Josh. You want to stump him. He likes being asked, why some particular tiny street has the name it does. He did. You were phenomenal on the radio the other day, answering a ton of questions on that.
We're not answering. I got stumped.
Well, let's see if people can stump him. So put your questions in the Q&A, as Katie said. The Hart Island thing, reminded me too of the fact that even with the name Manhattan, is this right that scholars are not sure what that actually meant? Can you tell us a little bit about the state of play of that?
Absolutely, yeah. No, the name Manhattan, it comes from the name Mannahatta, which essentially sort of enters history, enters the sort of written record after Henry Hudson floats through the Narrows and begins exploring the river that would be named after him in 1609. And the member of his crew sort of was keeping a log, wrote down, he said, this side of the river is known to the natives, to the Lenape, as Mannahatta. Writes that down. It appears in a couple other maps around that time. But it's quite unclear exactly, what he heard. He was writing down these couple syllables that perhaps one of the Native Americans they encountered said, quite unclear. In any case, since that time, people have sort of argued over what that term meant, and there was in the 19th century a popular version from a guy who fancied himself at least a kind of eminent philologist, Professor Heckewelder, if I'm remembering his name, in 1822 proposed that Mannahatta meant island where we all became intoxicated, which later was sort of discredited. It seems that he had a kind of offensive sort of tendency to identify Native American names with drinking. Later on, the most popular one for a long time was that it meant island of hills. But there's other people who say Hudson seamen probably just heard Menating, which means island in Lenape, which is just, they were saying, this may look like the mainland, but it's actually an island. So, there's Spite and Dival up there if you want to check it out. But our best guess at present, and it's still absolutely debated, but a fluent Munsee speaker quite some time ago proposed that what his imagining of what that Sarah would have heard is Mannahatum, which in Munsee means place where we gathered wood for bows and arrows. And that's because, Manhattan was full of beautiful hard ash and hickory trees, and they would have, gathered wood in that way. But this is still debated, and I think that what that evokes, in a certain sense, is this really interesting way in which Native American place names of all kinds, are all over our maps. But many of them, some of them we can sort of trace exactly what they mean. Many of them are these kind of skewed renderings of something that someone heard. But it seems that colonists and people who, were actively pushing people off their land were also really attached to labeling it with names that at least sounded Native American. Walt Whitman famously said, "I was looking for, savage and luxuriant syllables." That's his phrase, I believe. And behold, they all fit. And he's like, Mississippi, what an incredible word. Quoting him verbatim, but it sounds like a river that's thousands of miles long. And I think that something of that sort of runs through American naming. We have no fewer than 26 states that have Native American roots or aspects to them, which is a striking fact.
Well, I think you do a phenomenal job throughout the book of writing about equity and about the legacy of racism and just the politics behind naming and renaming, both on the question of what to do with offensive names. I can't remember how many, but I think you'd said how many street names there are in New York City that are named after slave owners.
Yeah, we know in Brooklyn itself, the best number that folks have come up with in the last few years is perhaps 70, thereabouts, streets that are named after people who own slaves. So, yeah.
And then this I didn't quite realize how extensive the work being done to propose new names or alternative names. And it's a kind of funny situation. Maybe it was new to me just how big an undertaking it is now. So what's going on with that? Tell us how that works.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, well, the story about sort of using names to uncover histories and some of these dark histories, which it's incumbent on all of us to confront and figure out how to address in the present. A lot of people don't know, or at least don't know, the sort of extent to which New York was a slave port, right? This was a place that was shaped by the triangle trade for centuries. And to me, I think the big task is sort of figuring out how to get the names to speak, how to get the names to sort of help us see these histories and understand them. The step of putting a marker on Wall Street and Water Street, where the main slave auction block was in Manhattan a few years ago, I think is a vital step to just helping us understand the centrality of slavery to American capitalism. What you ask about in terms of name changes, right? There's obviously a big and vital national conversation going on about removing monuments and changing street names, especially those named after Confederates or people who are sympathetic to the Confederate cause. And to me, those debates, many of them are not complicated in the sense that if you look at the sort of context and the sort of moment in which many of those names appeared, they weren't sort of neutral markers of history that emerged from the antebellum South. They were put on our maps or on our public squares, in the 1910s and 20s at the depths of Jim Crow, and they were basically sort of assertions of white supremacy. So I think that, having a robust sort of civil conversation about why those things can and should be removed or changed makes absolute sense. It's also the case, though, that for me, one thing I'm fascinated in is how we can, how meanings often change with time. And I think that Harlem is an instructive example in this regard. Harlem is founded by men who are associated with the Dutch West India Company, which is a company that makes gobs of money off buying and selling human beings. That's a dark history. That's important to know and study and understand. It's also the case that Harlem became, centuries later, those two magic syllables became iconic of Black freedom and Black pride, and it's important to sort of reckon with that fact as well. And I think that changing names willy-nilly is not a wise thing to do. I think it requires sort of hard conversation, and that's as it should be. But one thing I'll say about your question about sort of—
No, that's a good answer. That's a good
yeah.
answer.
No, and also though in New York, I mean, one of the funny things in New York, and this is distinctive to New York, is that New York is so, and I think part of it is just that we as New Yorkers are so kind of in love with our city, or at least in love with the idea of its grandeur and how many great things have happened here and so on, that we have a very kind of liberal policy about second or honorary names. Since the 90s in particular, this thing called Local Law 28, where city council now, it's much easier for local politicians and city council people to, propose new name changes and to have them ratified. And they're not actually changes, they're second or honorary names. And anyone now who lives in the city is familiar with these, that you're walking down the street and you see, now in Brooklyn, not far from Greenlight, notorious notorious B.I.G. Way, or Bob Marley Boulevard, or Shirley Chisholm Place, right? All these names that honor people who New Yorkers want to honor. And I think that's a wonderful thing, and it sort of lays the second order geography on the city, but not without controversy. Some people feel like it's gone too far. And I think it's a quarter of city council's local laws every year now are honorary streets. So this
is that right?
That's become an epidemic. And like I say, I tend to love it. It's a fun and amusing thing about walking around the city and navigating it. But some people feel different.
I'm going to throw it open to questions in 1 minute. Keep dumping them into the Q&A there, everybody. But my last question for you was that I was jotting down names. Part of the magic of this book is names that have been lost. And I loved, in particular, I loved Satan's Circus. Satan Circus was a
So
great one. And
we have Hell's Kitchen, but Satan Circus.
that would do us well. I wish we hadn't lost that. Paisley Place would have been a very nice one. And of course, Utopia. You know, maybe could you tell the Utopia and the Utopia Parkway?
I could, absolutely. No, that's almost, it's a sad story, but so kind of poetically.
I like the sad ones. I can't help it. I like the sad stories.
No, Utopia Parkway in Queens, you know, which is still there, obviously. Essentially, it was constructed to lead the way to a housing development, which was going to be called Utopia. And of course, many places, especially in Queens, are sort of named, their housing developers named them. You know, Rego Park is the Real Good Construction Company. And
that's a great one.
I think it's hilarious. Jackson Heights is, you know, it's certainly not high. It's in a low place, but the Queensboro Corporation named it. Anyway, there's many like this. But yes, Utopia was meant to be a place that in that era when these kind of new developments were going up, but many of them were racially exclusive. You know, they didn't let in people of color, they didn't let in Jews. And Utopia was meant to be this place where Jews were going to be welcome. This was sort of in the 20s, 30s when these things were going up. And sadly, the developers ran out of money. The place that ended up not getting built, but Utopia Parkway remains. And what's kind of poetic about that is that obviously the etymology of Utopia means literally, it means no place, right? To return to topos, toponymy, right? Topos means place, you means no. So it's a place that doesn't exist, right? And so Utopia Parkway leads to a little utopia, but it's still on the map.
It's a perfect New York story.
Right.
Well, this book, I mean, as I think anybody could tell, there's just so many pleasures and delights here, and you'll learn a ton from it. I know I've learned a ton from it. I love talking with you about it. I'd love to open it up. I see there's some questions in the Q&A. I don't know if Katie will read those out.
Yeah, I can pop on and read them.
Okay.
Hello. Our first question is from Mary Jane Cotter. Where would you recommend a visit to see place names dating back to the Dutch and Lenape, Washington Heights, Inwood? Question mark.
Cool. Yeah, wait, let me just, yeah. See place names dating back to the Dutch. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, because you'd think that Lower Manhattan or sort of around Battery Park or the site of old New Amsterdam would be where you'd want to go for Dutch place names, but it's not really the case, right? You have Peter Minuit Square down there, but really nothing else. And I think partly that's just because the English, when they took over, they're like, we really absolutely need to expunge the memory of the Dutch. So there's not many down there. But yeah, the Dutch place names are scattered all over the city. You know, many of the sort of surnames of sort of grand personages, you know, Bleecker Street. Bowery, of course, comes from the Dutch word for Bowery for farm road that went to Peter Stuyvesant's farm. And many of the sort of old Utrecht, right? New Utrecht village in what's now southern Brooklyn. Yonkers, Matt mentioned briefly. Yonkers is an interesting one where it essentially a Yonker in Dutch colonial times was a kind of man of property, right? A kind of a young squire, if you like, and the most prominent such person in colonial Dutch New Amsterdam was a guy called Adrian van der Donk, who was a lawyer and a jurist who was really vital actually to the history of the colony and sort of history of toleration, as they called it. But in any case, he owned an estate in what's now Yonkers, and so he was a famous Yonker, and so there you go. There's Yonkers. But no, Dutch place names are sort of scattered all over. Tappan Zee is another one. It's and actually this is a good way to answer this question because this is a Lenape and Dutch place name put together. Tappan, that was a band of Native Americans who lived in that part of what's now Westchester County, the Tappan. And Z is the old Dutch word for sea. So that place where the Hudson gets all wide, you know, where the bridge goes over, it's like a sea. So you have the Tappan Z.
It's such a great name.
Such
You
great
also, you had, if I remember right, another good point about why there's so many Dutch names outside the city because of the wealth of the Dutch establishing then estates, right, outside beyond the city.
For sure. And I mean, it's funny, you know, over the last year, I've been spending a bit more time up in the Hudson Valley. And of course, the Hudson Valley is full of Dutch place names, you know, from Kinderhook to all the rest, Malaysia and all these places. So yeah, I mean, those roots, that colonial story reaches back that far, and the Dutch absolutely left their mark. And there were people, you know, and you can still even hear in the Hudson Valley up until shockingly recently, you know, there was a kind of an old Dutch that was spoken, and people had an accent in certain kind of out of the way places. So no, the impress is here, absolutely. The Dutch ghosts.
Over to you, Katie. You got another one there?
Yeah. Our next question is from Ishrat Syed. Really delighted about your book. I lived in Borough Park in the final years of the 20th century and was always intrigued by the old new Utrecht Road. Do you have a story about that naming?
The old new Utrecht Road, I love it. It's fun. I mean, the basic story there, the particulars of that street now, I'm not sure I have anything, but of course, New Utrecht was one of the original Dutch villages that were chartered by Peter Stuyvesant in the era of New Amsterdam. The others being what became Flatlands, Flatbush. Brooklyn was one that was right on the river. Right? It was just a village by what's now the Brooklyn Bridge. And New Utrecht was another. And it's funny because when you say new, I have a speculation. Obviously, I should look this up and you can fact check it afterwards. But there's a funny way in which when the English came, they did, as I mentioned, sort of riffed on these Dutch names. And I would speculate, okay, there's a road going to New Utrecht, and then there's another road going to New Utrecht. But they said, oh, the old New Utrecht Road, right, would be the road going to the village. That would be my guess. And the reason I say that is because there's a similar story in Staten Island, where the word dorp is just an old Dutch word for village. And there's New Dorp and Old Dorp, right, in Staten Island. And that, of course, is just the English being like, oh, we like this kind of cute word for village, but we'll add another one, so you have New Dorp. But anyway, it's just an example of them sort of riffing on the place names that are there. And as I say, I would guess, and I should Google it right now, that New Old Utrecht is something like that.
It's crazy old English.
Yeah, exactly.
Ishrat has a follow-up question. Says they say thanks. We are talking naming here, and what's the story behind your unusual hyphenate surname?
Such a good question. I've never been asked that. In fact, I have, but no, that's great. So it's just my mother's name is Jelly, my father's name is Shapiro. So just, you know, hippie parents. That's the basic story. But Jelly is Scots Irish. It's comes from County Antrim. I've looked into it, and so essentially it's like Kelly with a J. That's the simplest way to put it. And apparently there's a part of Northern Ireland where there's lots of jellies, but I haven't really been anywhere else except for Atlantic Canada, where there are some other jellies. But yeah, and then Shapiro is Lithuanian Jewish. My father grew up in northern New Jersey, so that's Jelly-Schapiro.
Cool. All right. Our next question is from Anahi Antara. Definitive for Northmore, name or direction?
I got nothing to.
Oh, that's tough. Yeah, that's.
Sorry to say, Northmore. It's funny. It's so funny though that initial thing, right? N.more. I don't have an answer there, but I can't resist telling an anecdote about another just initial that was added recently to a street sign in southern Brooklyn, and that's Corbin Place in Manhattan Beach. And that's a really interesting story on this question of name changes, actually. That Austin Corbin, who's the developer who built up that part of Brooklyn in the 19th century, sort of a Fred Trump of his era, he happened to be a sort of raging anti-Semite. He was like a president of the American Society for the Suppression of Jews, this very hateful man. And this history has, of course, been sort of known for some time. But people obviously also have warm memories of growing up in Corbin Place and in that part of Brooklyn. And so the kind of end around that the community there came up with was kind of inspired. They have just added the letter M to Corbin Place. So it's M. Corbin Place now. So they didn't change the name, but they changed who it references. And so now Corbin Place references Margaret Corbin, who was a sort of a foremost woman participant in the American Revolutionary War in New York.
Wow.
So a different kind of hero. And that was I thought that was a beautiful way to not
great. Yeah,
sort of give us a new hero. Yeah.
Next question from Carl Taylor. Hi, Josh. Any stories behind Grand Street or Willett Street on the Lower East Side?
Grants, I got nothing.
We stumped him. We stumped him.
You did. See, this is what Google's for. But no, but you know what? One thing I'll say about that part of Manhattan, there's an interesting story about just Grand Street makes me think of it. That Great Jones Street is a kind of leftover Britishism from in London. If you go there, there's little streets and then great streets, and often it's just to distinguish them. One's the little version and one's the bigger version. So there was a Jones Street and then Great Jones Street, sort of named an early 19th century politician. So that's why we have Great Jones Street still. But the interesting anecdote there is that the term jonesing evidently emerged from that place's reputation some decades ago as a place to score narcotics. So Great Jones becomes jonesing in this way.
Okay, next question is from Stewart King. I grew up in the Bronx and have a long-standing fascination with Hunts Point. Any knowledge of its origin?
Hunts Point. No, nothing authoritative that I can give you off the top of my head. I'm trying to remember. I did read about Hunts Point at one point. One presumes it was a hunting ground, right? There are many places that were sort of named for the game that were caught there in colonial days. So that's perhaps the origin there. The Bronx, I will say one thing that's distinctive about the Bronx is there are lots of really interesting little clusters of street names that sort of trivia lovers really get into. And part of that is because the sort of surveyors and developers who developed the outer boroughs and often did so kind of whole cloth, like you buy a farm and just turn it into 30 square blocks. So they had to name a lot of streets, en masse. And so you have in the northern Bronx, there's a fascinating cluster of streets, for example, named for electricity, which is to say there's ampere and ohm and watt, all one right after the other. And because they were developed on the old property of the electricity magnate in the early 20th century. There's a bunch that are, classical. There's Cincinnatus and Virgil and all these kind of allusions to classic Greek literature. And that developer was a guy who, loved the classics. So that was his prerogative to put those there. But anyway, those are all over the city. But Hunts Point, we got to look it up right away.
That's kind of one of those fascinating things where, because you can see through the names how the city was shaped and how a developer ruled.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and you have, in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, for example, people are probably familiar with, there's that series of streets which are just named for towns upstate, Troy, Schenectady, Utica, all these. And the story about that is basically when the Lefferts farm there was cut up, essentially the developer and the surveyor decided to celebrate the opening of the Erie Canal, which was a recent happening. And so the streets actually are in geographic order of a journey right upstate and across to Buffalo, which is a wonderful kind of overlaying of another geography onto the city.
Looks like we've got one last one. It's from Anne Mulligan. Can you shed any light on some of the street names in Brooklyn Heights? Vine, Pine, etc. Is there a story behind these?
Yeah, let's see. Well, the best Brooklyn Heights story I have for you is the fruit streets, so-called, right? You have Cranberry Street and Pineapple and so on. And there's two theories as to where those came from. One is that some greengrocers who had some local juice there were behind sort of naming those streets in the late 1800s to market their wares. But the more likely story is that a sort of prominent local citizen, a woman with a surname Middock, there's still a Middock Street in that part of Brooklyn, she felt that there were too many streets that were named after illustrious families. She thought it would be nicer to have things named after fruits for some reason. But it's kind of amusing because she left, if that's the case, she left her own family's namesake street alone, put up all these things and convinced the powers that be that these were better street names. And so there they are. And so many stories like that where citizens have actually sort of acted to sort of change street names, and then they become legitimate. And I'll tell you just one story about that I love from Queens is the Scrabble Corner, the famous Scrabble Corner in Jackson Heights, which if you go out there on let's see, I think it's 87th Street and 35th Avenue, if I'm getting that right, or 37th in Jackson Heights. Anyway, there's a corner where the sign for the avenue just has these little subtle subscript, numbers like on Scrabble tiles, right? What they mark is the fact that right at that intersection in the basement of the Methodist Church during the Depression, this guy called Alfred Butts invented Scrabble, the best loved board game there is. And so some decades later, a sort of local historian added this kind of subtle street sign, not in a legal way, it was very DIY, right? But people grew to love it. And finally the city got around to taking it down. But by that time, the local city council person, Danny Drum, he really sort of fought to have the Scrabble sign reattached to that corner. And so it's there. And so that's a wonderful example of like people, kind of citizens celebrating histories that they care about and then becoming legitimate. But one thing I try and write about and explore in this book is the way that all of us are kind of making place all the time. And there's a wonderful wealth of nicknames and neighborhood names that immigrants and new arrivals, and that all of us kind of attach to where we are. And some of them end up on street signs too. I love that on the Lower East Side now, there's Lower Side Avenue, which is the Puerto Rican term for that part of Manhattan. So these processes are always ongoing.
I want to end, that's a beautiful note to end on. I want to end on one last question, if I may. Say I or somebody else wants to do one of those ceremonial street names for you, make Jelly-Schapiro Way or Jelly-Schapiro Street. What street do you want it to be?
What an awesome question. I think what I'd love is to find a little rock out in the harbor somewhere. It's maybe only slightly visible at low tide. We could put a little flag on there.
All right, I'm gonna get right on that with the city. Josh, this is a fabulous book. I hope everyone will buy a copy. Congratulations to you and to Pantheon Books, and huge thank you to Greenlight Bookstore for hosting.
Such a pleasure. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone. And yes, Greenlight forever. We love you.
Josh and Matt, thank you both so much for that fantastic discussion. It was so interesting. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Don't forget to buy your copy of Names of New York in store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. The link is in the chat. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.